This audiobook edition of Jawaharlal Nehru's The Discovery of India is brought to you by Giribala Joshi. This short YouTube podcast is a part of a larger project. Please subscribe to the channel and like and share the videos. This audiobook is created with the help of advanced text-to-speech AI technology.
Chapter 9, The Last Phase, 3. Part 7, Tension. In India, tension grew in those early months of 1942. The theater of war came ever nearer, and there was now the probability of air raids over Indian cities. What was going to happen in those eastern countries where war was raging? What new development would take place in the relations between India and England? Were we going to carry on in the old way, glaring at each other, tied up and separated by the bitter memories of past history, victims of a tragic fate which none could avert? Or would common perils help us to bridge that chasm? Even the bazaars woke up from their normal lethargy, a wave of excitement passed over them, and they buzzed with all manner of rumors. The money classes were afraid of the future that was advancing so swiftly towards them, for that future, whatever else it might be, was likely to upset the social structure they were accustomed to and endanger their interests and special position. The peasant and the worker had no such fear, for he had little to lose, and he looked forward to any change from his present unhappy condition. In India, there had all along been much sympathy for China, and as a consequence, a certain antipathy to Japan. The Pacific War, it was thought at first, would bring relief to China. For 4.5 years, China had fought single-handed against Japan. Now she had powerful allies, and surely this must lighten her burden and lessen her danger. But those allies suffered blow after blow, and before the advancing Japanese armies the British colonial empire cracked up with amazing rapidity. Was this proud structure then just a house of cards with no foundations or inner strength? Inevitably, comparisons were made with China's long resistance to Japanese aggression in spite of her lack of almost everything required for modern war. China went up in people's estimation, and though Japan was not liked, there was a feeling of satisfaction at the collapse of old established European colonial powers before the armed strength of an Asiatic power. That racial, Oriental Asiatic feeling was evident on the British side also. Defeat and disaster were bitter enough, but the fact that an Oriental and Asiatic power had triumphed over them added to the bitterness and humiliation. An Englishman occupying a high position said that he would have preferred it if the Prince of Wales and the Repulse had been sunk by the Germans instead of by the Yellow Japanese. The visit of the Chinese leaders, Generalissimo and Madame Chiang Kai-shek, was a great event in India. Official conventions and the wishes of the government of India prevented them from mixing with the people, but their presence in India itself at that critical stage, and their manifest sympathy for India's freedom helped to bring India out of her national shell and increased her awareness of the international issues at stake. The bonds that tied India and China grew stronger, and so did the desire to line up with China and other nations against the common adversary. The peril to India helped to bring nationalism and internationalism close together, the only separating factor being the policy of the British government. The government of India were no doubt very conscious of the approaching perils. There must have been anxiety in their minds and a sense of urgency. But such was the conventional existence of the British in India, so set were they in their established grooves, so wedded to the never-ending processes of bureaucratic red tape, that no marked change was visible in their outlook or activities. There was no sense of hurry and speed, of tension in getting things done. The system they represented had been built up for another age and with other objectives. Whether it was their army or their civil services, the objective in view was the occupation of India, and of suppression of any attempts of the Indian people to free themselves. It was sufficient enough for that purpose, but modern war against a powerful and ruthless adversary was a very different matter, and they found it exceedingly difficult to adapt themselves to it. They were not only mentally unfitted for this, but a great part of their energies was absorbed in keeping down nationalism in India. The collapse of the Burmese and Malayan administrations before new problems had been significant and revealing, yet it taught no lesson. Burma had been governed by the same kind of civil service as India, indeed till a few years ago, it had been part of the Indian administration. The ways of government there were identical with those of India, and Burma had demonstrated how moribund this system was. But the system continued without change, and the viceroy and his high officials functioned in the same way as before. They added to their number many of the higher officials who had failed so conspicuously in Burma. There was another excellency sitting on the hilltop at Shimla. Like the émigré governments in London, we were given the privilege of having in our midst émigré officials from British colonies. They fitted like a glove into the British structure in India. Like shadows on a stage, these high officials continued to function in their old way, trying to impress us with their elaborate imperial ritual, their court ceremonies, their dibars and investitures, their parades, their dinners and evening dresses, their pompous utterances. The Viceroy's house in New Delhi was the chief temple, where the high priest officiated, but there were many other temples and priests. All this ceremonial and display of imperial pomp was designed to impress, and it had impressed our people in the old days, for Indians are also given to ceremonial observances. But new standards had arisen, different values had been created, and now this elaborate show was the subject of jest and ridicule. Indians are supposed to be a slow-moving people, disinclined to rush and hurry, but even they had developed a certain speed and vigor in their work, so strong was their desire to get things done. The Congress provincial governments, whatever their failings might have been, were anxious to achieve results and worked hard and continuously, disregarding many old established routines. It was irritating to see the passivity and slowness of the government of India and its many agents in the face of grave crisis and peril. And then came the Americans. They were very much in a hurry, eager to get things done, ignorant of the ways and ceremonial of the government of India, and not particularly anxious to learn them. Intolerant of delay, they pushed aside obstructions and red tape methods and upset the even tenor of life in New Delhi. They were not even careful of the dress they should wear on particular occasions, and sometimes offended against the rigid rules of protocol and official procedure. While the help they were bringing was very welcome, they were not liked in the highest official circles, and relations were strained. Indians liked them on the whole, their energy and enthusiasm for the work in hand were infectious, and contrasted with the lack of these qualities in British official circles in India. Their forthrightness and freedom from official constraints were appreciated. There was much silent amusement at the underlying friction between the newcomers and the official class, and many true or imagined stories of this were repeated. The approach of the war to India disturbed Gandhi greatly. It was not easy to fit in his policy and program of non-violence with this new development. Obviously, civil disobedience was out of the question in the face of an invading army or between two opposing armies. Passivity or acceptance of invasion were equally out of the question. What then? His own colleagues, and the Congress generally, had rejected non-violence for such an occasion, or as an alternative to armed resistance to invasion, and he had at last agreed that they had a right to do so, but he was nonetheless troubled, and for his own part, as an individual, he could not join any violent course of action. But he was much more than an individual, whether he had any official status or not in the nationalist movement. He occupied an outstanding and dominating position, and his word carried weight with large numbers of people. Gandhiji knew India, and especially the Indian masses, as very few, if any, have known them in the past or the present. Not only had he widely traveled all over India and come into touch with millions of people, but there was something else which enabled him to come into emotional contact with those masses. He could merge himself with the masses and feel with them, and because they were conscious of this they gave him their devotion and loyalty. And yet his view of India was to some extent colored by the outlook he had imbibed in his early days in Gujarat. The Gujaratis were essentially a community of peaceful traders and merchants, influenced by the Jain doctrine of non-violence. Other parts of India had been influenced much less by this, and some not at all. The widespread Kshatriya class of warriors certainly did not allow it to interfere with war or hunting wild animals. Other classes also, including the Brahmins, had been as a whole little influenced by it. But Gandhiji took an eclectic view of the development of Indian thought and history, and believed that non-violence had been the basic principle underlying it, even though there had been many deviations from it. That view appeared to be far-fetched, and many Indian thinkers and historians did not agree with it. This had nothing to do with the merits of non-violence in the present stage of human existence, but it did indicate a historical bias in Gandhiji's mind. The accidents of geography have had a powerful effect on determining national character and history. The fact that India was cut off by the tremendous barrier of the Himalayas and by the sea produced a sense of unity in this wide area, and at the same time bred exclusiveness. Over this vast territory a vivid and homogeneous civilization grew up, which had plenty of scope for expansion and development, and which continued to preserve a strong cultural unity. Yet, within that unity, geography again produced diversity. The huge northern and central plain differed from the hilly and variegated areas of the Deccan, and the people living in different geographical areas developed different characteristics. History also took a different course in the north and in the south, though often the two overlapped and joined hands. The flatness of the land, and the vast open spaces of the north, as in Russia, required powerful central governments for protection against external enemies. Empires flourished in the south as well as the north, but the north was really the center of empire and often dominated the south. A strong central government in the old days inevitably meant autocracy. It was not a mere accident of history that the Mughal Empire was broken up, among other causes, by the Marathas. The Marathas came from the hilly tracts of the Deccan, and had preserved some spirit of independence when the great majority of the dwellers on the northern plains had grown servile and submissive. The British had an easy victory in Bengal, and the people of the fertile plains there submitted with extraordinary docility. Having established themselves there, they spread elsewhere. Geography counts still and must count in the future, but other factors play a more important role now. Mountains and seas are no longer barriers, but they still determine a people's character and a country's political and economic position. They cannot be ignored in considering new schemes of division, partition or remerging, unless the planning is on a world scale. Gandhiji's knowledge of India and the Indian people is profound. Though not greatly interested in history as such, and perhaps not possessing that feeling for history, that historical sense, which some people have, he is fully conscious and intimately aware of the historical roots of the Indian people. He is well informed about current events, and follows them carefully, though inevitably he concentrates on present-day Indian problems. He has a capacity for picking out the essence of a problem or a situation, avoiding non-essentials. Judging everything by what he considers the moral aspect, he gets a certain grip and a longer perspective. Bernard Shaw has said that though he, Gandhi, may commit any number of tactical errors, his essential strategy continues to be right. Most people, however, are not much concerned with the long run, they are far more interested in the tactical advantage of the moment. End of Part 7, titled, Tension, of Chapter 9. Part 8, Sir Stafford Cripps comes to India. With the fall of Penang and Singapore, and as the Japanese advanced in Malaya, there was an exodus of Indians and others, and they poured into India. They had to leave very suddenly, carrying nothing with them except the clothes they were in. Then followed the flood of refugees from Burma, hundreds of thousands of them, mostly Indians. The story of how they had been deserted by civil and other authorities, and left to shift for themselves, spread throughout India. They trekked hundreds of miles across mountains and through dense forests, surrounded by enemies, many dying on the way, killed by dagger or disease or starvation. That was a horrible result of the war and had to be accepted. But it was not the war that caused discrimination in treatment between Indian and British refugees. The latter were cared for as far as possible and arrangements made for their transport and assistance. From one place in Burma, where vast numbers of refugees were gathering, there were two roads leading to India. The better one was reserved for Britishers or Europeans. It came to be known as the White Road. Horrible stories of racial discrimination and suffering reached us, and as the famished survivors spread out all over India, they carried these stories with them, creating a powerful effect on the Indian mind. Just then, Sir Stafford Cripps came to India with the proposals of the British War Cabinet. Those proposals have been discussed fully during the past 2.5 years, and they are past history already. It is a little difficult for one who took part in the negotiations that followed to deal with them in any detail without saying much that had better to be left unsaid till some future time. As a matter of fact, all the relevant issues and considerations that arose have already been made public. I remember that when I read those proposals for the first time, I was profoundly depressed, and that depression was largely due to the fact that I had expected something more substantial from Sir Stafford Cripps, as well as from the critical situation that had arisen. The more I read those proposals and considered their many implications, the greater was my feeling of depression. I could understand a person unacquainted with Indian affairs imagining that they went far to meet our demands. But, when analyzed, there were so many limitations, and the very acceptance of the principle of self-determination was fettered and circumscribed in such a way as to imperil our future. The proposals dealt essentially with the future, after the cessation of hostilities, though there was a final clause, which vaguely invited cooperation in the present. That future, while asserting the principle of self-determination, gave the right to provinces not to join the Indian Union, and to form separate independent states. Further, the same right of non-accession to the Indian Union was given to the Indian states, and it should be remembered that there are nearly 600 such states in India, some major ones and the great majority tiny enclaves. These states, as well as the provinces, would all join in the constitution making, would influence that constitution, and then could walk out of it. The whole background would be of separatism, and the real problems of the country, economic or political, would take secondary place. Reactionary elements, differing from each other in many ways, would unite to frustrate the evolution of a strong, progressive, unified national state. Under the constant threat of withdrawal, many undesirable provisions might be introduced into the constitution, the central government might be weakened and emasculated, and yet the withdrawal might still follow, and it would be difficult then to refashion the constitution and make it more workable for the remaining provinces and states. The elections in the provinces for the constitution-making body would take place under the existing system of separate religious electorates. That was unfortunate, as it would bring with it the old spirit of cleavage, and yet, in the circumstances, it was inevitable. But in the states, there was no provision for elections, and their 90 million inhabitants were completely ignored. The semi-feudal rulers of the states could nominate their own representatives in proportion to the population. These nominees might contain some able ministers, but as a whole, they would inevitably represent, not the people of the states, but the feudal and autocratic ruler. They would form nearly 1/4 of the members of the constitution-making body, and would powerfully influence its decisions by their numbers, their socially backward attitude, and their threats of subsequent withdrawal. The Constituent Assembly or constitution-making body would be a curious mixture of elected and non-elected elements, the former chosen by separate religious electorates as well as by certain vested interests, the latter nominated by the rulers of the states. To this, had to be added the fact that there would be no pressure to accept joint decision, and the sense of reality which comes from evolving integrates and final decisions would be lacking. The tendency for many of its members would be to act in a wholly irresponsible manner, for they would feel that they could always withdraw and refuse to accept the responsibility for carrying out those decisions. Any proposal to cut up India into parts was a painful one to contemplate. It went against all those deeply felt sentiments and convictions that move people so powerfully. The whole nationalist movement of India had been based on India's unity, but the sentiment was older and deeper than the present phase of nationalism. It went far back into the remote periods of Indian history. That belief and sentiment had been strengthened by modern developments till it had become an article of faith for vast numbers of people, something that could not be challenged or controverted. A challenge had come from the Muslim League, but few took it seriously, and there were certainly large numbers of Muslims who did not agree with it. Even the basis of that challenge was not really territorial, though it suggested a vague undefined partition of territory. The basis was a medieval conception of nations based on religious differences, and according to it, therefore, in every village in India there were 2 or more nations. Even a partition of India could not get over these widespread and overlapping religious divisions. A partition would, in fact, add to the difficulty and increase the very problems it was intended to solve. Apart from sentiment, there were solid reasons against partition. The social and economic problems of India had reached a crisis, chiefly because of the policy of the British government, which necessitated rapid and all-round progress if the gravest of disasters had to be averted. That progress could only take place with real and effective planning for the whole of India, for the various parts supplied each other's deficiencies. As a whole, India was to a large extent a powerful and self-sufficient unit, but each part by itself would be weak and dependent on others. If all these, and other, arguments were valid and sufficient in the past, they became doubly important through modern political and economic developments. Small states were disappearing everywhere as independent entities, they were becoming absorbed in, or economic appendages to, the larger states. There was an inevitable tendency for vast federations, or collections of many states functioning together, to grow up. The idea of the national state itself was giving place to the multinational state, and in the distant future there appeared a vision of a world federation. To think of partitioning India at this stage went against the whole current of modern historical and economic development. It seemed to be fantastic in the extreme. And yet, under stress of dire necessity or some compelling disaster, one has to agree to many undesirable things. Circumstances may force a partition of what logically and normally must not be divided. But the proposals put forward on behalf of the British government did not deal with any definite and particular partition of India. They opened out a vista of an indefinite number of partitions both of provinces and states. They incited all the reactionary, feudal, and socially backward groups to claim partition. Probably none of them seriously wanted it because they could not stand by themselves. But they could give a lot of trouble, and obstruct and delay the formation of a free Indian state. If they were backed by British policy, as they well might be, it meant no freedom at all for a long time. Our experience of that policy had been bitter, and at every stage we had found that it encouraged vociferous tendencies. What was the guarantee that it would not continue to do so, and then claim that it could not fulfill its promise because the conditions for it were lacking? Indeed, the probability was that this policy would continue. Thus, this proposal was not a mere acceptance of Pakistan or a particular partition, bad as that would have been, but something much worse, opening the door to the possibility of an indefinite number of partitions. It was a continuing menace to the freedom of India, and a barrier to the fulfillment of the very promise that had been made. The decision about the future of the Indian states was not going to be made by the people of those states or their chosen representatives, but by their autocratic rulers. Our acceptance of this principle would have been a negation of our well-established and often repeated policy, and a betrayal of the people of the states, who would have been condemned to autocratic rule for a much longer period. We were prepared to treat the princes as gently as possible, so as to gain their cooperation in the changeover to democracy, and if there had been no third party, like the British power, we would no doubt have succeeded. But with the British government supporting autocracy in the states, the princes were likely to keep out of the Indian Union and rely on British military support for protection against their own people. Indeed, we were told that if such circumstances arose, foreign armed forces would be kept in the states. As these states were often likely to be isolated islands in the territory of the proposed Indian Union, the question arose how foreign forces could reach them or communicate with the forces in some other similar state. That necessitated a right-of-way for foreign forces over the territory of the Indian Union. Gandhiji had repeatedly declared that he was no enemy of the princes. Indeed, his attitude has been consistently a friendly one towards them, though he had often criticized their methods of government and their denial of even elementary rights to their people. For many years, he had prevented the Congress from interfering directly with the affairs of the states, believing as he did, that the people of the states should themselves take the initiative and thus develop self-confidence and strength. Many of us had disapproved of this attitude of his. Yet, behind it lay one basic conviction, as he put it himself: one fundamental element in my attitude is that I shall never be a party to the sale of the rights of the people of the states, even, for the sake of the freedom of the people of British India. Professor Berriedale Keith, the eminent authority on the British Commonwealth and Indian constitutions, supported Gandhiji's claim, which was the Congress claim, in regard to the states. Keith wrote, "It is impossible for the Crown's advisers to contend that the people of the states shall be denied the rights of Indians in the provinces, and it is their clear duty to advise the King Emperor to use his authority to secure that the princes shall enter into constitutional reforms, which will result at no distant date in securing responsible government therein. No federation can be deemed in the interest of India, if in it representatives of the provinces are compelled to sit with the nominees of irresponsible rulers. There is, in fact, no answer to Mr. Gandhi's claim that the princes are bound to follow the Crown in its transfer of authority to the people." Professor Keith had given this opinion in regard to the earlier proposal of the British government relating to federation, but it was even more applicable to the proposals brought by Sir Stafford Cripps. The more one thought of these proposals, the more fantastic they grew. India became a checkerboard, containing scores of nominally independent or semi-independent states, many of them relying on Britain for military protection of autocratic rule. There was to be neither political nor economic unity, and Britain might well continue to exercise dominating power, both politically and economically, through the many petty states she controlled. Footnote: the entire dependence of the Indian states on British power and protection is stressed by Sir Geoffrey de Montmorency in his The Indian States and Indian Federation, 1942. The states are still so numerous in India that they offer a grave conundrum in evolution to which no solution is at present forthcoming. Their disappearance and absorption would, of course, be inevitable if Britain ever ceased to be the supreme power as regards India. End of footnote. What the British War Cabinet had in mind for the future, I do not know. I think Sir Stafford Cripps meant well for India, and hoped to see her free and united. But this was not a matter of individual views or opinions or personal goodwill. We had to consider a state document, carefully drafted in spite of its deliberate vagueness, and we were told that we had to accept it or reject it as a whole. And behind it lay the continuous, century-old policy of the British government, creating division in India, and encouraging every factor that came in the way of national growth and freedom. Every forward step that had been taken in the past had always been hedged in by qualifications and limitations, which seemed innocuous enough at the beginning, and yet which proved to be formidable checks and brakes. It was possible, and even probable, that the dire consequences that seemed to flow from the proposals need not all take shape. Wisdom and patriotism, and a larger view of what was good for India and the world, would no doubt influence many people, including rulers and ministers of Indian states. Left to ourselves, we would have faced each other with confidence, considered all the complexities of the problem and the difficulties that faced each group, and after full deliberation hammered out an integrated solution. But we were not going to be left to ourselves in spite of the suggestion that we were going to exercise self-determination. The British government was always there, occupying strategic points, in a position to hinder and interfere in many ways. It controlled not only the whole apparatus of government, services, etc., but, in the states, its residents and political agents occupied a dominating position. Indeed, the princes, autocratic as they were as regards their people, were themselves completely subject to the control of the political department, which was directly under the viceroy. Many of their principal ministers had been imposed upon them, and were members of British services. Even if we escaped many of the possible consequences of the British proposals, enough remained to undermine Indian freedom, delay progress, and raise fresh and dangerous problems which would create enormous difficulties. The introduction of separate religious electorates a generation or more earlier had played enough mischief. Now the door was open to every obscurantist group giving trouble, and to the fear of continuing division and vivisection of India. We were asked to pledge ourselves to this arrangement for that undetermined future, which was to emerge as the issue of the war. Not only the National Congress, but politically, the most moderate of our politicians, who had always cooperated with the British government, expressed their inability to do so. And yet the Congress, for all its passion for Indian unity, was anxious to win over the minority and other groups, and even declared that a territorial unit could not be kept in the Indian Union against the declared will of its people. It accepted the principle even of partition, if this became unavoidable, but it did not want to encourage it in any way. The Working Committee of the Congress, in the course of its resolution on the Cripps proposals, said, "The Congress has been wedded to Indian freedom and unity, and any break in that unity, especially in the modern world, when people's minds inevitably think in terms of ever larger federations, would be injurious to all concerned, and exceedingly painful to contemplate." Nevertheless, the committee cannot think in terms of compelling the people in any territorial unit to remain in an Indian Union against their declared and established will. While recognizing this principle, the committee feel that every effort should be made to create conditions which would help the different units in developing a common and cooperative national life. The acceptance of the principle inevitably involves that no changes should be made which result in fresh problems being created and compulsion being exercised on other substantial groups within that area. Each territorial unit should have the fullest possible autonomy within the Union, consistent with a strong national state. The proposal now made on the part of the British War Cabinet encourages and will lead to attempts at separation at the very inception of a union and thus create friction just when the utmost cooperation and goodwill are most needed. This proposal has been presumably made to meet a communal demand, but it will have other consequences also and lead politically reactionary and obscurantist groups among different communities to create trouble, and divert public attention from the vital issues before the country. The committee went on to say that in today's grave crisis, it is the present that counts, and even proposals for the future are important in so far as they affect the present. Although they had been unable to agree to the proposals made for the future, they were anxious to come to some settlement so that, as they said, India might shoulder the burden of her defense worthily. There was no question of non-violence involved, and no mention of this was made at any stage. In fact, one of the matters discussed was that there should be an Indian Minister of Defense. The Congress position at this stage was that in view of the imminent war peril to India they were prepared to put aside questions about the future, and concentrate on the formation of a national government which would cooperate fully in the war. They could not agree to the British government's specific proposals for the future, as these involved all manner of dangerous commitments. So far as they were concerned, these proposals could be withdrawn, or might remain as an indication of British intention, it being clearly understood that the Congress did not accept them. But this need not come in the way of finding a method for present cooperation. So far as the present was concerned, the British War Cabinet's proposals were vague and incomplete, except that they made it clear that the defence of India must remain the sole charge of the British government. From Sir Stafford Cripps' repeated statements, it appeared that except for defense, all other subjects would be transferred to effective Indian control. There was even mention of the Viceroy functioning merely as a constitutional head, like the King of England. This led us to imagine that the only issue that remained for consideration was that of defense. Our position was that defense in wartime might be made to cover, and to a large extent did cover, most other national activities and functions. If defense was wholly removed from the scope of the national government's work, very little might remain. It was agreed that the British Commander-in-Chief would continue to exercise full authority over the armed forces and military operations. It was also agreed that the general strategy would be directed by the Imperial Staff. Apart from this, it was claimed that there should be a defense member of the national government. After some discussion, it was agreed by Sir Stafford that there might be a defense department under an Indian member, but the matters to be dealt with by this department were public relations, petroleum, canteens, stationery and printing, social arrangements for foreign missions, amenities for troops, etc. This list was remarkable, and made the position of an Indian defense member ludicrous. Further discussions led to a somewhat different approach. There still seemed to be a considerable gap between the two viewpoints, but we seemed to be moving towards one another. For the first time, I felt, and so did others, that a settlement was probable. The deepening crisis in the war situation was a continuous spur to all of us to come to an agreement. The peril of war and invasion was great, and had in any event to be met. Yet there were different ways of meeting it, or rather there was only one really effective way of doing so in the present, and much more so for the future. We felt that the psychological moment might pass, not only bringing present dangers in its train but also adding to the greater dangers of the future. New weapons were necessary as well as old, new ways of using them, new enthusiasms, new horizons, a new faith in a future that was going to be essentially different from the past and the present, and the proof of it lay in a change in the present. Perhaps our eagerness fed our optimism, and made us forget for a while or minimize the width and depth of the formidable chasm that separated us from Britain's rulers. It was not so easy for the centuries-old conflict to be resolved even in face of peril and disaster. It had never been easy for an imperial power to loosen its grip on its subject dominions unless forced to do so. Had circumstances produced that force, that conviction? We did not know, but we hoped it might be so. And then, just when I was most hopeful, all manner of odd things began to happen. Lord Halifax, speaking somewhere in the USA, made a violent attack on the National Congress. Why he should do so just then in far America was not obvious, but he could hardly speak in that manner when he presented the views and policy of the British government. In Delhi it was well known that the Viceroy, Lord Linlithgow, and the high officials of the civil service were strongly opposed to a settlement and to a lessening of their powers. Much happened which was only vaguely known. When we met Sir Stafford Cripps again to discuss the latest formula about the functions of the defense minister, it transpired that all our previous talk was entirely beside the point, as there were going to be no ministers with any power. The existing Viceroy's Executive Council was to continue, and all that was contemplated was to appoint additional Indians, representing political parties, to this council. The council was in no sense a cabinet, it was just a group of heads of departments or secretaries, and all power was concentrated in the Viceroy's hands. We realized that legal changes take time, and we had not therefore pressed for them, but we insisted that a convention should be observed that the Viceroy was to treat this council as a cabinet and accept its decisions. We were now told that this was not possible, and the Viceroy's powers must remain unaltered not only in theory but in practice. This was an astonishing development which we could hardly credit, for all our previous talks had taken place on a different basis. We discussed how we could increase India's powers of resistance against invasion. We were anxious to make the Indian Army feel that it was a national army, and thus to introduce a patriotic element in the war. Also to build up new armies, militias, home guards, etc., rapidly for home defense in case of invasion. All these would of course function under the Commander-in-Chief. We were told that we could not do so. The Indian Army was really a part and section of the British Army, and it could not be considered, or even referred to, as a national army. It was further doubtful if we could be allowed to raise any separate forces like militias or home guards. So it all came to this, that the existing structure of government would continue exactly as before, the autocratic powers of the Viceroy would remain, and a few of us could become his liveried camp followers, and look after canteens and the like. There was not an atom of difference between this and what Mr. Amory had offered 18 months earlier, which had seemed to us then an affront to India. It was true that there would be a psychological change after all that had happened, and individuals make a difference. Strong and capable men would function differently from the servile breed that usually surrounded the vice-regal throne. But it was inconceivable and impossible for us to accept this position at any time, and more especially at that time. If we had ventured to do so, we would have been disowned and rejected by our own people. As a matter of fact, when later, the facts were known to the public, there was an outcry against the many concessions we had agreed to in the course of the negotiations. In the whole course of our talks with Sir Stafford Cripps, the so-called minority or communal issue was at no time raised or considered. Indeed, it did not arise at that stage. It was an important issue in considering future constitutional changes, but these had been deliberately put aside after our initial reaction to the British proposals. If the principle of an effective transfer of power to a national government had been agreed to, then the question would no doubt have arisen as to the relative strengths of the various groups represented in it. But as we never reached the stage of agreement on that principle, the other question did not arise and was not considered at all. So far as we were concerned, we were so anxious to have an effective national government enjoying the confidence of the principal parties, that we felt that the question of proportions would not give much trouble. Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, the Congress President, in a letter to Sir Stafford Cripps had said, "We would point out to you that the suggestions we have put forward are not ours only, but may be considered to be the unanimous demand of the Indian people. On these matters there is no difference of opinion among various groups and parties, and the difference is as between the Indian people as a whole and the British government. Such differences as exist in India relate to constitutional changes in the future. We are agreeable to the postponement of this issue so that the largest possible measure of unity might be achieved in the present crisis for the defence of India. It would be a tragedy that even when there is this unanimity of opinion in India, the British government should prevent a free national government from functioning and from serving the cause of India, as well as the larger causes for which millions are suffering and dying today." In a subsequent and final letter of the Congress President it was stated, "We are not interested in the Congress as such gaining power, but we are interested in the Indian people as a whole having freedom and power. We are convinced that if the British government did not pursue a policy of encouraging disruption, all of us, to whatever party or group we belonged, would be able to come together and find a common line of action. But, unhappily, even in this grave hour of peril, the British government is unable to give up its wrecking policy. We are driven to the conclusion that it attaches more importance to holding on to its rule in India, as long as it can, and promoting discord and disruption here with that end in view, than to an effective defence of India against the aggression and invasion that overhang us. To us, and to all Indians, the dominant consideration is the defence and safety of India, and it is by that test that we judge." In this letter, he also made clear our position in regard to defence. No one has suggested any restrictions on the normal powers of the Commander-in-Chief. Indeed, we went beyond this, and were prepared to agree to further powers being given to him as War Minister. But it is clear that the British government's conception and ours in regard to defence differ greatly. For us, it means giving it a national character and calling upon every man and woman in India to participate in it. It means trusting our own people, and seeking their full cooperation in this great effort. The British government's view seems to be based on an utter lack of confidence in the Indian people, and in withholding real power from them. You refer to the paramount duty and responsibility of His Majesty's government in regard to defence. That duty and responsibility cannot be discharged effectively unless the Indian people are made to have and feel their responsibility, and the recent past stands witness to this. The government of India do not realise that the war can only be fought on a popular basis. Almost immediately after this last letter of the Congress President, Sir Stafford Cripps returned to England by air. But before he did so, and on his return, he made certain statements to the public which were contrary to the facts, and which were bitterly resented in India. In spite of contradiction by responsible persons in India, these statements were repeated by Sir Stafford and others. The British proposals had been rejected, not by the Congress only, but by every single party or group in India. Even the most moderate of our politicians had expressed their disapproval of them. Apart from the Muslim League, the reasons for disapproval were more or less the same. The Muslim League, as has been its custom, waited for others to express their opinions and then, for its own reasons, rejected the proposals. It was stated in the British Parliament and elsewhere that the rejection by the Congress was due to the uncompromising attitude of Gandhiji. This is wholly untrue. Gandhiji had strongly disapproved, in common with most others, of the indefinite and innumerable partitions that the proposals involved, and of the way in which the 90 million people of the Indian states had been allowed no say in their future. All the subsequent negotiations, which dealt with changes in the present and not with the future, took place in his absence, as he had to leave because of his wife's illness, and he had nothing whatever to do with them. The Congress Working Committee had, on several previous occasions, disagreed with him on the question of nonviolence, and was anxious to have a national government to cooperate in the war, and especially in the defense of India. The war was the dominant issue and thought in men's minds, and the invasion of India seemed imminent. And yet it was not the war that came in the way of agreement, for that war would inevitably have to be conducted by experts and not by laymen. On the conduct of the war itself, it was easy to come to an agreement. The real question was the transfer of power to the national government. It was the old issue of Indian nationalism versus British imperialism, and on that issue, war or no war, the British governing class in England and in India was determined to hold on to what it had. Behind them stood the imposing figure of Mr. Winston Churchill. End of Part 8, titled, Sir Stafford Cripps Comes to India, of Chapter 9. Part 9, Frustration. The abrupt termination of the Cripps negotiations, and Sir Stafford's sudden departure came as a surprise. Was it to make this feeble offer, which turned out to be, so far as the present was concerned, a mere repetition of what had been repeatedly said before? Was it for this that a member of the British War Cabinet had journeyed to India? Or had all this been done merely as a propaganda stunt for the people of the USA? The reaction was strong and bitter. There was no hope of a settlement with Britain, no chance was given to the people of India even to defend their country against invasion as they wanted to. Meanwhile the chances of that invasion were growing, and hordes of starving Indian refugees were pouring across the eastern frontiers of India. In eastern Bengal, in a panicky state of mind in anticipation of an invasion, tens of thousands of river boats were destroyed. It was subsequently stated that this had been done by a mistaken interpretation of an official order. That vast area was full of waterways and the only transport possible was by these boats. Their destruction isolated large communities, destroyed their means of livelihood and transport, and was one of the contributory causes of the Bengal famine. Preparations were made for large-scale withdrawals from Bengal, and a repetition of what had happened in Rangoon and Lower Burma seemed probable. In the city of Madras, a vague and unconfirmed, and, as it turned out, a false, rumor of the approach of a Japanese fleet led to the sudden departure of high government officials and even to a partial destruction of harbor facilities. It seemed that the civilian administration of India was suffering from a nervous breakdown. It was strong only in its suppression of Indian nationalism. What were we to do? We could not tolerate any part of India submitting tamely to invasion. So far as armed resistance was concerned, that was a matter for the Army and Air Force, such as they were. American help was pouring in, especially in the shape of aircraft, and was slowly changing the military situation. The only way we could have helped was by changing the whole atmosphere of the home front, by creating enthusiasm in the people, and a fierce desire to resist at all costs, by building up citizen forces for this purpose and home guards and the like. That had been made terribly difficult for us by British policy. Even on the eve of invasion no Indian outside the regular army could be trusted with a gun, and even our attempts to organize unarmed self-defense units in villages were disapproved and sometimes suppressed. Far from encouraging the organization of popular resistance, the British authorities were afraid of this, for they had long been accustomed to look upon all popular self-defense organizations as seditious and dangerous to British rule. They had to follow their old policy, for the only alternative was to accept a national government relying on the people and organizing them for defense. This alternative had been definitely rejected by them, and there was no middle course or halfway house. Inevitably they were led to treat the people as chattels, who were to be allowed no initiative, and were to be used and disposed of entirely according to their own wishes. The All India Congress Committee, which met at the end of April, 1942, declared its deep resentment at this policy and treatment, and said that it could never accept a position which involved our functioning as slaves of foreign authority. Nevertheless, we could not remain silent and inert spectators of the tragedy that seemed to be imminent. We had to advise the people, the vast masses of the civilian population, as to what they should do in case of invasion. We told them that in spite of their indignation against British policy, they must not interfere in any way with the operations of the British or Allied armed forces, as this would be giving indirect aid to the enemy aggressor. Further, that they must on no account submit to the invader, or obey his orders, or accept any favors from him. If the invading forces sought to take possession of the people's homes and fields, they must be resisted even unto death. This resistance was to be peaceful, it was to be the completest form of non-cooperation with the enemy. Many people criticized with considerable sarcasm what seemed to them the absurd notion of resisting an invading army with these methods of non-violent non-cooperation. Yet far from being absurd, it was the only method, and a very brave method, left to the people. The advice was not offered to the armed forces, nor was peaceful resistance put forward as an alternative to armed resistance. That advice was meant only for the unarmed civilian population, which almost invariably submits to the invader when its armed forces are defeated or withdrawn. Apart from the regular armed forces, it is possible to organize guerrilla units to harass the enemy. But this was not possible for us, for it requires training, arms, and the full cooperation of the regular army. And even if some guerrilla units could have been trained, the rest of the population remained. Normally the civilian population is expected to submit to enemy occupation. Indeed, it was known that directions had been issued by British authorities in certain threatened areas advising submission, even by some of the petty officials, to the enemy when the army and the higher officials withdrew. We knew perfectly well that peaceful non-cooperation could not stop an advancing enemy force. We knew also that most of the civilian inhabitants would find it difficult to resist even if they wanted to do so. Nevertheless, we hoped that some leading personalities in the towns and villages occupied by the enemy would refuse to submit or carry out the enemy's orders or help in getting provisions or in any other way. That would have meant swift punishment for them, very probably death as well as reprisals. We expected this non-submission and resistance to death of even a limited number of persons to have a powerful effect on the general population, not only in the area concerned but in the rest of India. Thus, we hoped that a national spirit of resistance might be built up. For some months previously, we had been organizing, often in the face of official opposition, food committees and self-defense units in towns and villages. The food problem was troubling us and we feared a crisis in view of the increasing difficulties of transport and other developments of the war situation. Government was doing next to nothing in regard to this. We tried to organize self-sufficient units, especially in the rural areas, and to encourage primitive methods of transport by bullock cart, in case modern methods failed. There was also the possibility of large numbers of refugees and evacuees suddenly marching west, as they had done in China, in case of invasion from the east. We tried to prepare ourselves to receive them and provide for them. All this was exceedingly difficult, indeed hardly possible, without the cooperation of the government, yet we made such attempts as we could. The purpose of the self-defense units was to help in these tasks and to prevent panic and keep order in their respective areas. Air raids and the news of invasion, even in a distant area, might well cause panic in the civilian population, and it was important to stop this. The official measures taken in this behalf were totally insufficient, and looked upon with distrust by the public. In the rural areas, dacoities and robberies were on the increase. We made these vast plans, and in a small measure gave effect to them, but it was obvious that we were only scratching the surface of the tremendous problem which confronted us. A real solution could come only through complete cooperation between the governmental apparatus and the people, and that had been found to be impossible. It was a heartbreaking situation, for while the crisis called to us, and we were bubbling over with the desire to act, effective action was denied us. Catastrophe and disaster advanced with tremendous strides towards us, while India lay helpless and inert, bitter and sullen, a battleground for rival and foreign forces. Much as I hated war, the prospect of a Japanese invasion of India had in no way frightened me. At the back of my mind, I was in a sense attracted to this coming of war, horrible as it was, to India. For I wanted a tremendous shake-up, a personal experience for millions of people, which would drag them out of that piece of the grave that Britain had imposed upon us. Something that would force them to face the reality of today, and to outgrow the past which clung to them so tenaciously, to get beyond the petty political squabbles and exaggerations of temporary problems, which filled their minds. Not to break with the past, and yet not to live in it, realize the present and look to the future. To change the rhythm of life, and make it in tune with this present and future. The cost of war was heavy, and the consequences full of uncertainty. That war was not of our seeking, but since it had come, it could be made to harden the fiber of the nation, and provide those vital experiences out of which a new life might blossom forth. Vast numbers would die, that was inevitable, but it is better to die in war than through famine, it is better to die than to live a miserable, hopeless life. Out of death, life is born afresh, and individuals and nations who do not know how to die, do not know also how to live. Only where there are graves are there resurrections. But though the war had come to India, it had brought no exhilaration of the spirit to us, no pouring out of our energies in some glad endeavor, when pain and death were forgotten and self itself ignored, and only the cause of freedom counted and the vision of the future that lay beyond. Only the suffering and sorrow were for us, and an awareness of impending disaster which sharpened our perceptions and quickened pain, and which we could not even help to avert. A brooding sense of inevitable and ineluctable tragedy grew upon us, a tragedy that was both personal and national. This had nothing to do with victory or defeat in the war, with who won and who lost. We did not want the Axis powers to win, for that led to certain disaster. We did not want the Japanese to enter or occupy any part of India. That had to be resisted anyhow, and we repeatedly impressed the public with this fact, but all this was a negative approach. What positive aim was there in this war? What future would emerge out of it? Was it just a repetition of past follies and disasters, a play of nature's blind forces which took no cognizance of man's wishes and ideals? What was going to be the fate of India? We thought of Rabindranath Tagore's last testament, his deathbed message given the year before. He wrote, "The demon of barbarity has given up all pretense, and has emerged with unconcealed fangs ready to tear up humanity in an orgy of devastation." From one end of the world to the other, the poisonous fumes of hatred darken the atmosphere. The spirit of violence, which perhaps lay dormant in the psychology of the West, has at last roused itself, and desecrated the spirit of man. The wheels of fate will some day compel the English to give up their Indian empire. But what kind of India will they leave behind? What stark misery! When the stream of their centuries' administration runs dry at last, what a waste of mud and filth they will leave behind! I had one time believed that the springs of civilization would issue out of the heart of Europe. But today, when I am about to quit the world, that faith has gone bankrupt altogether. As I look round, I see the crumbling ruins of a proud civilization strewn like a vast heap of futility. And yet, I shall not commit the grievous sin of losing faith in man. I would rather look forward to the opening of a new chapter in his history after the cataclysm is over, and the atmosphere rendered clean with the spirit of service and sacrifice. Perhaps, that dawn will come from this horizon, from the east where the sun rises. A day will come when unvanquished man will retrace his path of conquest, despite all barriers, to win back his lost human heritage. Today, we witness the perils which attend on the insolence of might. One day shall be borne out the full truth of what the sages have proclaimed: by unrighteousness man prospers, gains what appears desirable, conquers enemies, but perishes at the root. End of the quotation from Rabindranath Tagore's last testament. No, one may not lose faith in man. God we may deny, but what hope is there for us, if we deny man and thus reduce everything to futility? Yet, it was difficult to have faith in anything or to believe that the triumph of righteousness is inevitable. Weary of body and troubled in mind, I sought escape from my surroundings and journeyed to Kulu, in the inner valleys of the Himalayas. End of Part 9, titled, Frustration, of Chapter 9. Part 10, The Challenge, Quit India Resolution. On my return from Kulu, after a fortnight's absence, I realized that the internal situation was changing rapidly. The reaction from the failure of the last attempt at a settlement had grown, and there was a feeling that no hope lay in that direction. British official statements in Parliament and elsewhere had confirmed that view and angered the people. Official policy in India was definitely aiming at the suppression of our normal political and public activities, and there was an all-round tightening of pressure. Many of our workers had remained in prison throughout the Cripps negotiations. Now some of the nearest and most important of my friends and colleagues had been arrested and imprisoned under the Defence of India Act. Rapi Ahmed Kidwai was arrested early in May. Sri Krishna Dutt Paliwal, president of the United Provinces Provincial Congress Committee, followed soon after, and so did many others. It seemed that most of us would be picked off in this way and removed from the scene of action, and our national movement prevented from functioning and gradually disintegrated. Could we submit to all this passively? We had not been trained that way, and both our personal and national pride rose in revolt against this treatment. But what could we do in view of the grave war crisis and possibility of invasion? Yet, inaction was no service even to this cause, for it was leading to the growth of sentiments, which we viewed with anxiety and apprehension. There were many trends in public opinion, as was natural in such a vast country, and at such a time of crisis. Actual pro-Japanese sentiment was practically nil, for no one wanted to change masters, and pro-Chinese feelings were strong and widespread. But there was a small group which was indirectly pro-Japanese in the sense that it imagined that it could take advantage of a Japanese invasion for Indian freedom. They were influenced by the broadcasts being made by Subhas Chandra Bose, who had secretly escaped from India the year before. Most people were, of course, just passive, dumbly awaiting developments. If unfortunately circumstances so fashioned themselves that a part of India was under the invaders' control, then there would undoubtedly be many collaborators, especially among the upper-income groups, whose ruling passion was to save themselves and their property. That breed and mentality of collaborators had been cherished and encouraged by the British government in India in the past for its own purposes, and they could adapt themselves to changing circumstances, always keeping their own personal interests in view. We had seen collaboration in full flood even in France and Belgium and Norway and many of the occupied countries of Europe, in spite of growing resistance movements. We had seen how the men of Vichy had, in Pertinax's words, racked their brains to palm off shame as honor, cowardice as courage, pusillanimity and ignorance as wisdom, humiliation as virtue, and wholehearted acceptance of the German victory as moral regeneration. If that had been so in France, that country of revolution and fiery patriotism, it was certainly not unlikely among similar classes in India, where the mentality of collaboration had flourished for so long under British patronage and brought so many rewards. Indeed, it was highly likely that chief among those who might collaborate with the invader would be many of the persons who had been collaborating with British rule, and who proclaimed their loyalty to that rule from the housetops. They had perfected the art of collaboration, and would find no difficulty in holding on to that basis even though the superstructure changed. And if subsequently there was yet another change of that superstructure, well, they would readapt themselves again as others of their kind were doing in Europe. When necessity arose, they could take advantage of the anti-British feelings that had grown more powerful than ever after the failure of the Cripps negotiations. So would others also, not for personal and opportunist reasons, but pushed on by different motives, losing all perspective and forgetting the larger issues. These developments filled us with dismay, and we felt that the growth of enforced and sullen submission to British policy in India would lead to all manner of dangerous consequences and the complete degradation of the people. There was a fairly widespread feeling that in case of attempted invasion and occupation of some eastern areas, there would be a breakdown of the civil administration over larger areas elsewhere, leading to chaotic conditions. What had happened in Malaya and Burma was before us. Hardly anyone expected any considerable part of the country to be occupied by the enemy even if the chances of war favored him. India was vast, and we had seen in China that space counts. But space counts only when there is a determination to take advantage of it and resist, and not to collapse and submit. Apparently well-founded reports stated that the Allied armed forces would probably withdraw to inner lines of defense, leaving wide areas open to enemy occupation, though probably the enemy, as in China, might not actually occupy them all. So questions arose as to how we should meet this situation both in these areas as well as in other areas where the civil administration might cease to function. We tried, as far as we could, to prepare mentally and otherwise for such crises by encouraging local organizations which could function and keep order, and at the same time by insisting that the invader had to be resisted at any cost. Why had the Chinese fought so stoutly for many years? Why, above all others, had the Russians and other peoples of the Soviet Union fought with such courage, tenacity, and wholeheartedness? Elsewhere, people fought bravely also because they were moved by love of country, fear of aggression, and desire to preserve their ways of life. And yet, there appeared to be a difference in the wholeheartedness of the war effort between Russia and other countries. Others had fought magnificently as at the time of Dunkirk and after, but there had been some moral slackening of effort when the immediate crisis was past. It seemed as if there were some doubts about the future, though the war had anyhow to be won. In the Soviet Union, so far as one could judge from the material available, there seemed to be no doubt or debate, though it was true that debate was not encouraged, and there was a supreme confidence in both the present and the future. In India, there was a deep-seated dislike of the present, and the future seemed equally dark. No patriotic urge to action moved the people, only a desire to defend themselves against invasion and a worse fate. A few were moved by international considerations. Mixed up with all these feelings was resentment at being ordered about, suppressed and exploited by an alien and imperialist power. There was a fundamental wrongness in a system under which everything depended on the wishes and whims of an autocrat. Freedom is dear to all, but most of all to those who have been deprived of it, or those who are in danger of losing it. Freedom in the modern world is conditioned and limited in many ways, but those who do not possess it, do not realize these limitations, and idealize the conception, till it becomes a passionate craving and an overwhelming and consuming desire. If anything does not fit in with this longing or seems to go counter to it, that thing must inevitably suffer. The desire for freedom, for which so many in India had labored and suffered, had not only received a check, but it seemed that the prospect of it had receded into some dim and distant future. Instead of tacking that passion on to the world struggle that was going on, and drawing upon the vast reservoir of energy in the cause of Indian and world freedom and for India's defense, the war had been isolated from it, and no hope was centered in its issue. It is never wise to leave any people, even enemies, without hope. There were some, of course, in India who looked upon the war as something far bigger and vaster than the petty ambitions of the statesmen of the various countries involved in it, some who felt its revolutionary significance in their bones, and realized that its ultimate issue, and the consequences that would flow from it would take the world far beyond military victories and the pacts and utterances of politicians. But the number of these people was inevitably limited, and the great majority, as in other countries, took a narrower view, which they called realistic, and were governed by the considerations of the moment. Some, inclined to opportunism, adapted themselves to British policy and fitted themselves into it, as they would have collaborated with any other authority and policy. Some reacted strongly against this policy and felt that a submission to it was a betrayal not only of India's cause, but the world's cause. Most people became just passive, static, quiescent, the old failing of the Indian people against which we had struggled for so long. While this struggle was going on in India's mind and a feeling of desperation was growing, Gandhiji wrote a number of articles, which suddenly gave a new direction to people's thoughts, or, as often happens, gave shape to their vague ideas. Inaction at that critical stage and submission to all that was happening had become intolerable to him. The only way to meet that situation was for Indian freedom to be recognized and for a free India to meet aggression and invasion in cooperation with the Allied nations. If this recognition was not forthcoming, then some action must be taken to challenge the existing system, and wake up the people from the lethargy that was paralyzing them and making them easy prey to every kind of aggression. There was nothing new in this demand, for it was a repetition of what we had been saying all along, but there was a new urgency and passion in his speech and writing. And there was the hint of action. There was no doubt that he represented at the moment the prevailing sentiment in India. In a conflict between the two, nationalism had triumphed over internationalism, and Gandhiji's new writings created a stir all over India. And yet that nationalism was at no time opposed to internationalism, and indeed was trying its utmost to find some opening to fit in with that larger aspect, if only it could be given an opportunity to do so honorably and effectively. There was no necessary conflict between the two, for unlike the aggressive nationalisms of Europe, it did not seek to interfere with others but rather to cooperate with them to their common advantage. National freedom was seen as the essential basis of true internationalism, and hence as the road to the latter, as well as the real foundation for cooperation in the common struggle against fascism and Nazism. Meanwhile, that internationalism, which was being so much talked about, was beginning to look suspiciously like the old policy of the imperialist powers, in a new, and yet not so new, attire. Indeed, it was itself an aggressive nationalism, which in the name of empire or commonwealth or mandatory, sought to impose its will on others. Some of us were disturbed and upset by this new development, for action was futile unless it was effective action, and any such effective action must necessarily come in the way of the war effort at a time when India herself stood in peril of invasion. Gandhiji's general approach also seemed to ignore important international considerations and appeared to be based on a narrow view of nationalism. During the 3 years of war, we had deliberately followed a policy of non-embarrassment, and such action as we had indulged in had been in the nature of symbolic protest. That symbolic protest had assumed huge dimensions when 30,000 of our leading men and women were sent to prison in 1940-41. And yet even the prison-going was a selected individual affair, and avoided any mass upheaval or any direct interference with the governmental apparatus. We could not repeat that, and if we did something else it had to be of a different kind and on a more effective scale. Was this not bound to interfere with the war on India's borders and encourage the enemy? These were obvious difficulties, and we discussed them at length with Gandhiji without converting each other. The difficulties were there, and risks and perils seemed to follow any course of action or inaction. It became a question of balancing them and choosing the lesser evil. Our mutual discussion led to a clarification of much that had been vague and cloudy, and to Gandhiji's appreciation of many international factors to which his attention was drawn. His subsequent writing underwent a change, and he himself emphasized these international considerations and looked at India's problem in a wider perspective. But his fundamental attitude remained, his objection to a passive submission to British autocratic and repressive policy in India, and his intense desire to do something to challenge this. Submission, according to him, meant that India would be broken in spirit, and whatever shape the war might take, whatever its end might be, her people would act in a servile way and their freedom would not be achieved for a long time. It would mean also submission to an invader, and not continuing resistance to him, regardless, even of temporary military defeat or withdrawal. It would mean the complete demoralization of our people, and their losing all the strength that they had built up during a quarter of a century's unceasing struggle for freedom. It would mean that the world would forget India's demand for freedom, and the post-war settlement would be governed by the old imperialist urges and ambitions. Passionately desirous of India's freedom as he was, India was to him something more than his loved homeland. It was the symbol of all the colonial and exploited peoples of the world, the acid test whereby any world policy must be judged. If India remained unfree, then also the other colonial countries and subject races would continue in their present enslaved condition, and the war would have been fought in vain. It was essential to change the moral basis of the war. The armies and the navies and air forces would function in their respective spheres, and they might win by superior methods of violence, but to what end was their victory? And even armed warfare requires the support of morale. Had not Napoleon said that in war the moral is to the physical as 3-to-1? The moral factor of hundreds of millions of subject and exploited people all over the world, realizing and believing that this war was really for their freedom, was of immense importance even from the narrower viewpoint of the war, and much more so for the peace to come. The very fact that a crisis had risen in the fortunes of the war necessitated a change in outlook and policy and the conversion of these sullen and doubting millions into enthusiastic supporters. If this miracle could take place, all the military might of the Axis powers would be of little avail, and their collapse was assured. Many of the peoples of the Axis countries might themselves be affected by this powerful world sentiment. In India, it was better to convert the sullen passivity of the people into a spirit of non-submission and resistance. Though that non-submission would be, to begin with, to arbitrary orders of the British authorities, it could be turned into resistance to an invader. Submissiveness and servility to one would lead to the same attitude towards the other, and thus to humiliation and degradation. We were familiar with all these arguments, we believed them and had ourselves used them frequently. But the tragedy was that the policy of the British government prevented that miracle from taking place. All our attempts to solve the Indian problem, even temporarily, during the course of the war had failed, and all our requests for a declaration of war aims had been turned down. It was certain that a further attempt of this kind would also fail. What then? If it was to be conflict, however much it might be justified on moral or other grounds, there could be no doubt that it would tend to interfere greatly with the war effort in India at a time when the danger of invasion was considerable. There was no getting away from that fact. And yet, oddly enough, it was that very danger that had brought this crisis in our minds, for we could not remain idle spectators of it, and see our country mismanaged and ruined by people whom we considered incompetent and wholly incapable of shouldering the burden of a people's resistance, which the occasion demanded. All our pent-up passion and energy sought some outlet, some way of action. Gandhiji was getting on in years, he was in the 70s, and a long life of ceaseless activity, of hard toil, both physical and mental, had enfeebled his body, but he was still vigorous enough, and he felt that all his life work would be in vain if he submitted to circumstances then, and took no action to vindicate what he prized most. His love of freedom for India and all other exploited nations and peoples overcame even his strong adherence to nonviolence. He had previously given a grudging and rather reluctant consent to the Congress not adhering to this policy in regard to defense and the state's functions in an emergency, but he had kept himself aloof from this. He realized that his half-hearted attitude in this matter might well come in the way of a settlement with Britain and the United Nations. So he went further and himself sponsored a Congress resolution, which declared that the primary function of the Provisional Government of Free India would be to throw all her great resources in the struggle for freedom and against aggression, and to cooperate fully with the United Nations in the defence of India with all the armed as well as other forces at her command. It was no easy matter for him to commit himself in this way, but he swallowed the bitter pill, so overpowering was his desire that some settlement should be arrived at to enable India to resist the aggressor as a free nation. Many of the theoretical and other differences that had often separated some of us from Gandhiji disappeared, but still that major difficulty remained: any action on our part must interfere with the war effort. Gandhiji, to our surprise, still clung to the belief that a settlement with the British government was possible, and he said he would try his utmost to achieve it. And so, though he talked a great deal about action, he did not define it or indicate what he intended to do. While we were doubting and debating, the mood of the country changed, and from a sullen passivity, it rose to a pitch of excitement and expectation. Events were not waiting for a Congress decision or resolution, they had been pushed forward by Gandhiji's utterances, and now they were moving onwards with their own momentum. It was clear that, whether Gandhiji was right or wrong, he had crystallized the prevailing mood of the people. There was a desperateness in it, an emotional urge, which gave second place to logic and reason and a calm consideration of the consequences of action. Those consequences were not ignored, and it was realized that whether anything was achieved or not, the price paid in human suffering would be heavy. But the price that was being paid from day to day and torture of the mind was also heavy, and there was no prospect of escape from it. It was better to jump into the uncharted seas of action and do something, rather than be the tame objects of a malign fate. It was not a politician's approach, but that of a people grown desperate and reckless of consequences, yet there was always an appeal to reason, an attempt to rationalize conflicting emotions, to find some consistency in the fundamental inconsistencies of human character. The war was going to be a long one, to last many more years. There had been many disasters and there were likely to be more, but the war would continue in spite of them, till it had tamed and exhausted the passions which gave rise to it, and which it had itself encouraged. This time there would be no half-success, which are often more painful than failures. It had taken a wrong turn not only in the field of military action, but even more so in regard to the more fundamental objectives for which it was supposed to be fought. Perhaps, such action as we might indulge in might draw forcible attention to this latter failure, and help to give a new and more promising turn. And even if present success was lacking, it might serve that saving purpose in the longer run, and thus help also in giving powerful support in the future to military action. If the temper of the people rose, so also did the temper of the government. No emotional or other urge was required for this, for it was its natural temper, and its normal way of functioning, the way of an alien authority and occupation of a subject country. It seemed to welcome this opportunity of crushing once for all, as it thought, all the elements in the country which dared to oppose its will, and for this it prepared accordingly. Events marched ahead, and yet, curiously, Gandhiji, who had said so much about action to protect the honor of India and affirm her right to freedom, and as a free nation to cooperate fully in the fight against aggression, said nothing at all about the nature of this action. Peaceful, of course, it had necessarily to be, but what more? He began to lay greater stress on the possibilities of an agreement with the British government, of his intention to approach it again, and try his utmost to find a way out. His final speech at the All India Congress Committee expressed his earnest desire for a settlement, and his determination to approach the Viceroy for this. Neither in public, nor in private at the meetings of the Congress Working Committee, did he hint at the nature of the action he had in mind, except in one particular. He had suggested privately that in the event of failure of all negotiations, he would appeal for some kind of non-cooperation and a one-day protest hurtal, or cessation of all work in the country, something in the nature of a one-day general strike, symbolic of a nation's protest. Even this was a vague suggestion which he did not particularize, for he did not want to make any further plans till he had made his attempt at a settlement. So neither he nor the Congress Working Committee issued any kind of directions, public or private, except that people should be prepared for all developments, and should in any event adhere to the policy of peaceful and non-violent action. Though Gandhiji was still hopeful of finding some way out of the impasse, very few persons shared his hope. The course of events, and all the development that had taken place pointed inevitably to a conflict, and when that stage is reached, middle positions cease to have importance, and each individual has to choose on which side he will range himself. For congressmen, as for others who felt that way, there was no question of choice. It was inconceivable that the whole might of a powerful government should try to crush our people, and that any of us should stand by and be passive spectators of a struggle in which India's freedom was involved. Many people of course do stand by in spite of their sympathies, but any such attempt to save himself from the consequences of his own previous acts would have been shameful and dishonorable for prominent congressmen. But even apart from this, there was no choice left for them. The whole of India's past history pursued them, as well as the agony of the present and the hope of the future, and all these drove them forward and conditioned their actions. The piling up of the past upon the past goes on without relaxation, says Bergson in his Creative Evolution. In reality, the past is preserved by itself, automatically. In its entirety, probably, it follows us at every instant. Doubtless, we think with only a small part of our past, but it is with our entire past, including the original bent of our soul, that we desire, will, and act. On August 7 and 8, in Bombay, the All India Congress Committee considered and debated in public the resolution, which has since come to be known as the Quit India Resolution. That resolution was a long and comprehensive one, a reasoned argument for the immediate recognition of Indian freedom, and the ending of British rule in India, both for the sake of India and for the success of the cause of the United Nations. The continuation of that rule is degrading and enfeebling India, and making her progressively less capable of defending herself and of contributing to the cause of world freedom. The possession of empire, instead of adding to the strength of the ruling power, has become a burden and a curse. India, the classic land of modern imperialism, has become the crux of the question, for by the freedom of India will Britain and the United Nations be judged, and the peoples of Asia and Africa be filled with hope and enthusiasm. The resolution went on to suggest the formation of a provisional government, which would be composite, and would represent all important sections of the people, and whose primary function must be to defend India and resist aggression with all the armed as well as the non-violent forces at its command, together with its allied powers. This government would evolve a scheme for a constituent assembly which would prepare a constitution for India acceptable to all sections of the people. The constitution would be a federal one, with the largest measure of autonomy for the federating units, and with the residuary powers vesting in those units. Freedom will enable India to resist aggression effectively with the people's united will and strength behind it. This freedom of India must be the symbol of the prelude to the freedom of all other Asiatic nations. Further, a world federation of free nations was proposed, of which a beginning should be made with United Nations. The committee stated that it was anxious not to embarrass in any way the defense of China and Russia, whose freedom is precious and must be preserved, or to jeopardize the defensive capacity of the United Nations. At that time the dangers to China and Russia were the greatest, but the peril grows both to India and these nations, and inaction and submission to a foreign administration at this stage is not only degrading India, and reducing her capacity to defend herself and resist aggression, but is no answer to that growing peril and is no service to the peoples of the United Nations. The committee again appealed to Britain and the United Nations in the interest of world freedom. But, and there came the sting of the resolution, the committee is no longer justified in holding the nation back from endeavoring to assert its will against an imperialist and authoritarian government, which dominates over it and prevents it from functioning in its own interest and in the interest of humanity. The committee resolves therefore to sanction, for the vindication of India's inalienable right to freedom and independence, the starting of a mass struggle on non-violent lines under the inevitable leadership of Gandhiji. That sanction was to take effect only when Gandhiji so decided. Finally, it was stated that the committee had no intention of gaining power for the Congress. The power, when it comes, will belong to the whole people of India. In their concluding speeches, Maulana Abul Kalam Azad, the Congress president, and Gandhiji made it clear that their next steps would be to approach the Viceroy, as representing the British government, and to appeal to the heads of the principal United Nations for an honourable settlement, which, while recognising the freedom of India, would also advance the cause of the United Nations in the struggle against the aggressor Axis powers. The resolution was finally passed late in the evening of August 8, 1942. A few hours later, in the early morning of August 9, a large number of arrests were made in Bombay and all over the country. And so to Ahmednagar Fort. End of Part 10, titled, The Challenge, Quit India Resolution, of Chapter 9. This concludes the 9th chapter, titled, The Last Phase, 3.